So we are glad that you can join us today for the first in several webinars to learn and discuss about coastal resilience in working waterfront communities. I will be serving as your host today. My name is Jennifer Seavey, and I'm the Chief Programs Officer for the Island Institute, where we focus on boldly navigating climate and economic change with island and coastal communities to expand opportunities and deliver solutions. As we approach the 1-year anniversary of the devastating storms last year, we have learned a lot. And in this moment, those storms can serve as a catalyst for rebuilding with resilience. We will be exploring this topic over this series of seminars, and today is our first. So we have invited 3 contributors to Maine's newly just released last week, updated Climate Action Plan, Maine Won't Wait. We'll be learning from them about how the new recommendations will positively impact and support resilience in the working waterfront and coastal communities. Our first panelist is Susie Arnold, and she will be talking about an intro to the Climate Council and climate science. Susie is the Island Institute's senior ocean scientist, and she helps ensure that we infuse all that we do at the Island Institute with the latest scientific information and data. She also serves on the Maine Climate Council and is the co-chair of the Scientific and Technical Committee of that council. Dr. Arnold has a master's degree in marine policy and a doctoral degree in marine biology from the University of Maine. Kurt Brown will discuss how the Coastal Marine Working Group incorporated lessons learned from last winter's storm into the recommendations in the Climate Action Plan. Kurt serves as a marine biologist at Ready Seafood, which is a lobster processor and dealer in Portland, where he focuses on collaborative research projects that improve the sustainability and value of Maine lobster. He is an active commercial lobsterman, and he co-chaired the Coastal and Marine Working Group for the Maine Climate Council. He has a master's degree in marine biology and marine policy from the University of Maine. And our last panelist is Judy East, who will discuss how the Community Resilience Working Group incorporated lessons learned from last winter's storm into their recommendation for the action plan. Judy is the director of the Bureau of Resource Information and Land Use Planning in Maine's Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry. She has extensive rural, regional, and national land use planning experience. She co-authored the Community Resilience Working Group of the Maine Climate Council, and she has a master's degree in planning from the University of British Columbia. So Susie, I'm going to hand the mic to you.
Great. Thank you, Jen, and thank you everyone for attending. I'm going to kick it off as the first panelist, and I'm going to first touch on 2 reports that have been released in the last couple of weeks here in Maine. One that Jen mentioned already is the update to Maine's Climate Action Plan, known as Maine Won't Wait. Importantly, one of the goals for Maine's Climate Action Plan includes making Maine more resilient to the impacts of climate change. The second one, next slide, please, is the interim report of a commission that was established to address the winter storms that we experienced last year, or in December and January. This commission, known as the Infrastructure Rebuilding and Resilience Commission, released its interim report on November 15th, so just a couple weeks ago. And the overarching goals of this commission are to take immediate actions to provide storm response, to cement the foundation for resilience, and to integrate resilience for the long term. Now, we won't talk too much about this particular report in today's webinar, but this is kind of a teaser of what's to come in the next webinar on December 10th. And also of note, both Judy and Kurt are heavily involved in this commission as well. Next slide, please. So getting back to the report that was released by the Maine Climate Council, for those of you who aren't very familiar with the Maine Climate Council, it was established by the governor in 2019, and legislation was passed to create the Maine Climate Council, which is charged with creating the Maine State Action Plan every 4 years. In that legislation included the creation of two subcommittees, the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee and the Equity Subcommittee, as well as 6 working groups, and now 2 more task forces. So the Climate Council itself is made up of about 39 appointed members from scientists. So for example, I'm the appointed member with expertise in ocean climate change. It also has business leaders, state agency commissioners. The Scientific and Technical Subcommittee is made up of about 45 scientists, and the working groups include over 200 volunteers with expertise in their fields. So I am also the co-chair of the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee, so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the science coming out of that subcommittee, which informs the Maine Climate Action Plan. So in 2020, the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee released its first scientific assessment on effects of climate change on Maine. And in 2024, just this past May, we released an update to that report. Next slide, please. There it is. So this is a fairly dense report. It's 9 chapters long, over 250 pages. It is written with an audience of legislators in mind, so it's not overly technical. And I can direct you to the chapters that have relevance to today's discussion, because I understand that reading over 250 pages of science is a little daunting, but if you'd like more information on some of the figures and updates that I provide you with, they are found in the climate chapter, the marine ecosystems chapter, and also the chapter on sea level rise and coastal hazards. Now, something that I'm really proud of from this updated scientific assessment is the inclusion of a lot of social scientists onto the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee. So there's also a really robust chapter on the human dimensions of climate change. And there's also, lastly, a chapter that closes out the report on the science of hope. And why is that? Because we know that talking about facts doesn't really always prompt people to change their behavior. So it's really important to understand what does change behavior, and then also what is able to make people hopeful in the face of adversity, such as the climate crisis that we're facing now. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a few of the major findings, all of which play a role in the storm discussion. First, warming temperatures. It's well known the past 4 years. If you could click, Emma, the past 4 years have ranked among the 10 warmest on record. So if you look at the red line there, those last four dots are, as you can see, compared to the long-term average, quite high. We know that Maine is experiencing more rainfall. So if you could, there it is. Thanks, Emma. In fact, we're not just experiencing more rainfall overall, but we're seeing 1 to 2 more days per year with heavy precipitation events. We have shorter winters, which has implications, particularly in the December storm, with 2 weeks of shorter duration of winter. And so the ground not being frozen was a factor during that December storm. And of course, we have rising sea levels. So sea levels are 8 inches higher than they were a century ago. The figure that you're looking at down here on the right is showing sea level rise over time, with the projections out to 2050, with the state having adopted the commit to manage scenario, which is the intermediate scenario, looking at planning for 1.5 feet of relative sea level rise by 2050. And then for more at-risk infrastructure, the state has suggested preparing to manage for 3 feet by 2050. Okay, next slide, please. So what we experienced last winter were known as extratropical cyclones, or storms that originate in the mid-latitudes, typically between the fall and April. And these, interestingly, were southeaster storms, and we know that the direction and the damage generated a lot of concern around extratropical storm trends. So what you're seeing here are maximum wind gusts. And if you look at the January 10th and January 13th storms, you can see in red that we reached gusts upwards of 80 miles per hour. Next slide, please. So these high winds out of the southeast led to really high wave heights, which influenced storm surge. So you can see down here on January 10th, strong winds raised offshore wave heights to nearly 30 feet. And then if you look over that other bump, you can see on January 13th, we saw waves at these offshore buoys between 20 and 25 feet. So this brought particularly devastating impacts to Maine's southeast facing open ocean coastal areas. Okay, next slide. So this figure is showing the January 10th and 13th storm events at 3 different tide gauges next to the historic total water level at those 3 tide gauges. So in Portland, you can see the 78 storm next to the January 10th and 13th storms. So the January 10th storm really drove extreme storm surge and waves on top of kind of a near average high tide. The January 13th event was an example of moderate storm surge combining with a very high tide. So new total water level records were set at Portland and Bar Harbor on January 13th. So as you can see here, the combination of high tide, which is in blue, and storm surge, which is in red on January 10th and 13th, were not historically unprecedented, but they came on top of the rising sea level, which is that pink chunk at the top of the bar graph. And it's what caused the events to break records. So to give you an example, there have been 30 storm tides equivalent to or greater than the January 10th storm tide since 1912. So this indicates that a relatively moderate combination of tide and surge leads to extreme flooding because sea level is high. Okay, next slide. So this figure is showing monthly high water records. So record high sea levels were measured along the coast in 2023. 2023 set a new record high annual average sea level at all of 3 of Maine's long-term tide gauges, what we're looking at here, and also set new monthly average sea level records. So what you're looking at here is records for the highest monthly average water level and those that were broken. And you can see where it says first that basically for at least 6 months out of the year, we had record-breaking monthly averages across 2023. With all of the remaining months, except for one, that 5th under Portland next to February, falling within the top 3 highest levels for each month. So where are we at 2024? This is not reported in this figure, but if you look at the data from the tide tracker online, you can see that about 4 to 5 months out of 2024 so far per tide gauge have broken records. So it's a similar trend for 2024. Next slide, please. So we know that more investigation is needed to understand both historical and projected storm tides in Maine, particularly around the increasing frequency and intensity of southeast storm events. A preliminary study has shown no clear trend in frequency from 1950 to 2024. The study used data from the Jetport wind direction combined with low pressure data. What we do know is that Maine's climate is getting wetter with more high intensity precipitation in association with warming driven intensification of the hydrologic cycle. We know winter storms are projected to become more intense, meaning they have lower central pressure and increased heavy precipitation, but their frequency remains uncertain. Importantly, as sea levels rise, the same surges superimposed on higher sea levels will make coastal flooding and inundation more frequent and severe. Sea level rise has caused coastal flooding to occur 3 times more often since 2010, and the frequency of minor high tide flooding will increase over the next decade. So this is some of the science that gives you kind of the anatomy of the storms that we experienced last winter and what we know about what we could potentially expect going forward. And with that, I'm going to turn it over back to Jen for our next panelist.
Thanks, Susie. And now we're going to hear from Judy East on the community resilience side. Here you go, Judy.
Thank you, Jen, and wonderful introduction, Susie. Good morning, everybody. I'm coming to you today from Calais, Maine, where the peak wind influence December 18th was a year ago was 71 miles per hour, and we are literally still, my husband's out there, we're still cleaning up from that. And my story is not unique all over Maine. The influence of those southeast winds that we don't normally get, saturated ground, we've got a 6-acre farm, we lost 40 plus trees. So as co-chair of the resilience working group, I found these issues acutely personal, as did my two co-chairs. I want to mention and recognize Ann Fuchs. She is the Director of Mitigation Planning and Recovery at MEMA, the Maine's Emergency Management Agency, and Becca Boulos, who is the Executive Director of the Maine Public Health Association. Next slide, please. So we, in the original Maine Won't Wait, stressed capacity, increases in technical assistance to increase capacity in communities, as well as funding. That is still a very strong recommendation of our working group to expand the investment that's already been done, so that by 2030, 80% of Maine communities are enrolled in what was created 4 years ago, the Community Resilience Partnership. We want to track how well those grants are being used, and both to fill data gaps and also to see whether the activities that are building our resilience are having an impact. You will see recommendations from me and from Kurt later on about the importance of monitoring to ensure that what we're doing is having the desired effect. And that increasing technical assistance and capacity at all levels is critical to our response and our understanding. So next slide, please. A very strong conversation that took place in our working group was to improve Maine's preparation and recovery. This conversation had to do with looking at what happened in the storms of last year and increasing the communication, especially across state, county, and local levels in order to increase capacity. We discussed in many ways, and there are recommendations in the report to support planning and decision-making to reduce our exposure and our vulnerabilities. And then that metrics issue came up again. One thing I'll point out here that I'd like Sue, if she could, to put in the chat is a recent study called the Payoff, the Preparedness Payoff. Thank you, Sue. Put out by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, that for every dollar spent on resilience efforts and adaptation planning ahead of time, $13 is saved, not just in the cleanup, but also the economic impacts of the disasters that we are experiencing more and more all over the country. Next slide, please. And related to that is expanding access to funding and financing to be climate ready. This is for both addressing things that were destroyed and to create infrastructure that is more resilient to climate change. Within the report, there is a recommendation to the study, the idea of a resilience bank, where we might rely on access to private capital. I won't go into the details there. I encourage you to look both in the report and the individual working group reports that fed into the Climate Council, the report. There's an enormous amount of detail that all of the working groups prepared that then resulted in this document of the update of Maine Won't Wait. And some of the details around the Resilience Bank are in there. Also, we had conversations around the need to simplify and coordinate state grant application processes. so that just having the access to money is important, but not having the barrier of how on earth do I navigate these all these different application processes, and also navigate how to implement grants and on once you've got the money. So one of the approaches that the state has taken that's in the works now is the creation of the Maine Office of Community Affairs. There's a director that's been hired, and there will be 7 programs from 6 different agencies that will be moved within the next 7 months into the Maine Office of Community Affairs. Next slide, please. A common access portal for grant applications will be one of the things that they're working on, one of the very first things they work on. I'm not going to go into all of the detail in this slide. One thing I'll emphasize is that in the December 18th storm, especially the incredible flooding that was experienced, the unprecedented flooding that it was experienced in western inland communities in Maine, the residential oil tanks that were released and then spilled was a huge kind of secondary impact of the flooding that took place. So there's a lot of recommendations for helping people prepare homes and businesses to the multiple individual issues that they may face with these extreme weather events. Next slide, please. And then the awareness and action that is needed on the mental health impacts of climate change was discussed in detail. Again, the working group report and the subgroup that contributed to that. There's some wonderful detail there of the kinds of needs that are out there to strengthen the connections between those who respond and those who are planning for disasters. One of the things that I noticed in the comments received by the public, as this was out for public comment over the summer, were many people said, "I'm so glad you mentioned the public health impacts," though there were others who frankly scoffed at the idea. And I can only think that they haven't had the experience of some of the first responders that we spoke to in the work that the Resilience Commission did visiting places all over the state. It's overwhelming what Maine has dealt with, and I know we're not alone. In 18 months, we had 9 federal disaster declarations when usually we only have 1 a year. And it is exhausting and difficult. The mental health impacts also on young people are very real. And so there's recommendations in there both for top-down training and assistance to healthcare services throughout the state, and then sort of bottom-up programming within schools to give people a sense of direction, agency, that they can do something, and hope in the face of significant challenges here. Next slide. Then the new addition in this the update of Maine Won't Wait was an inter-working group task force of the co-chairs of each working group to discuss land use strategies. It was an issue that we kind of were a little overwhelmed by with the first report and tried to tackle in this update to Maine Won't Wait. I mentioned the Maine Office of Community Affairs and the need for technical assistance to support communities and how that will address that. The programs that are moving into the Maine Office of Community Affairs, I won't list all 7 of them, but they essentially cover the groundwork on housing, climate resilience, and land use. And integrating those programs in one shop should go a long way toward helping communities have a one place to go for both funding support and for technical assistance. And something I think came out, and I feel like I haven't stressed this enough with emergency management and then with land use, is that community engagement and communication strategies came up a lot, especially when you're thinking about with the focus of today, which is our readiness for, for the next one. How do we communicate? How do we interact? How do we coordinate at the multiple levels, state, local, and regional, in order to be ready and in order to respond? Next slide, please. And then this one, this will be my last slide with a segue over to Kurt's presentation on the working waterfront and marine impacts. But so I'll stress here that some of the land use strategies, as well as the resilience strategies, discussed the difficult but sometimes inevitable conversations about getting out of harm's way, or overall just avoiding growth in areas at risk of flooding. This requires, again, really skilled facilitation and community engagement, very good access to data, which is stressed here. And the point that I'll end on is there are land use strategies that individual communities can take for new growth in areas that is less vulnerable. Perhaps some people making the hard decision to move out of highly vulnerable areas. But when you're talking about the working waterfront, they're utterly dependent on being right there on the water. So I just want to make it clear that this notion of getting out of harm's way is a land use strategy for some communities. It's not an option for the working waterfront, at least not across the board. So I'll let Kurt pick up the conversation from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy, very much. Thanks everybody for joining this morning. It's really amazing to see so many folks joining us as we get close to the holidays on such an important issue. And I really appreciate everyone's time. As Judy mentioned, working waterfronts really took over our discussions as the Coastal and Marine Working Group of the Climate Council in January of last year, or of this year, I apologize. Before that, the Coastal and Marine Working Group of the Climate Council, of whom myself and Carl Wilson of the Department of Marine Resources right here in Maine was my co-chair. Through the first few months, which started in September, October, as a working group, I wouldn't say we were struggling, because with a working group full of so many people who are so talented and uniquely gifted in their areas, struggling wouldn't be the right word. We were just overwhelmed with ideas and options on what we could really focus on, given that as the Coastal and Marine Working Group, emissions reductions or increase in the number of electric vehicles or heat pumps wasn't really an option or a metric that we could use for our working group. So as we were working through all of that, we had a massive storm in December, and then obviously January really put the focus of the entire Climate Council, I would say, on our working group. And this issue of working waterfronts came to the forefront of not just our working group, but the Climate Council as a whole. And as Susie mentioned, and also as a teaser for one of these upcoming webinars, led to the formation of a resilience commission when it comes to infrastructure throughout the state, but also with working waterfront, really thinking strategically about how Maine will build going forward in the face of climate change and more storms like this. So after these storms struck, it really shaped our thinking as a working group. And as you can see in this slide, really came forward with some really impressive suggestions. And I would argue that these will shape a lot of our state going forward into the future. I won't go through everything on this slide because I want to leave plenty of time for Q&A at the end, but I'll show a couple of videos and pictures in a second to really emphasize the impact that this had on me personally. And I'm sure the majority of folks who are on this call right now, who were in Maine during December and January, have pictures and memories and all of that type of stuff from those storms. It certainly had an impact on our entire state, but really emphasizing the importance that our working waterfronts along our thousands of miles of coastline here in Maine have, and the importance of those working waterfronts really as the nexus between what is harvested and grown off the coast of our great state to the rest of the world. Without those working waterfronts, we wouldn't be able to get those products that are harvested and grown locally to markets around the world. And really emphasizing how we need to think strategically going forward. This is a quick video I took, and I'll be quiet while it plays, and then I'll explain it a little bit more. So this is Portland Headlight right in Cape Elizabeth, Maine, where I am speaking to you from right now. Portland Headlight is one of the oldest lighthouses in the country. During every storm we get, I try and beat a path over there and get pictures and videos. And the thing that struck me about this storm right here was this was the first time that I can remember seeing waves go up and over the roof of the lighthouse. And it's hard to see in this, but in that particular wave right there, there was a slab of concrete that was lifted up and thrown into the lighthouse that broke 3 windows and a door. And it was so unique to see that happening, because normally in January, when we're getting low pressure systems like this, they're nor'easters, which we're all familiar with, Maine nor'easters in the winter. And as Susie mentioned earlier, this was a sou'easter. This was coming from the southeast. And you wouldn't think a 90-degree difference in wind direction would make that much difference, but as the rest of the coast of Maine can attest to, that 90-degree difference, especially in the wintertime, made all the difference in the world. The damage that we saw to the lighthouse was minimal relative to the damage we saw along the rest of the coast and many, many bays and harbors. Most harbors along the coast of Maine are protected from storms from the northeast. That's why they are good winter harbors. And when that wind is coming from the southeast and those waves are coming from the southeast, it exposed a whole new swath of the coast of Maine to a direct hit from these 2 storms that did so much damage. And then if we move to the next slide, right after this storm on January 10th, in between the 10th and the 13th, you saw a little lull. This ground fishing boat tried to get out and go fishing in between those 2 storms and got caught in the storm on the way back in on January 13th. So when I woke up January 13th, this is Trundy Reef right off the coast of Cape Elizabeth. There was a groundfish boat that had run aground on its way back into Portland. And unfortunately for the boat, was a total loss. Fortunately for the crew members on board, they were rescued and nobody sustained any injuries. But I mean, this was a wild few days, as everybody I'm sure who was in the area probably remembers. And then another personal story from where I keep my boat right in Portland, on this next slide here, Deeks Wharf, which is right near the Imeskip terminal on the working waterfront of Portland Harbor. This was right in the middle of the January 13th storm. It looks very calm and protected, which fortunately for me, where I keep my boat, it is. But to Susie's point earlier, this was the first time water had ever come up over the wharf at Deeks Wharf, ever. And it came up not just a little bit, but by about 3 or 4 inches. And so this was, while not a lot of damage we see here on the 13th, we did see a lot of flooding throughout Portland Harbor. But fortunately for Portland, this was a lot less damage than many other places along the coast saw. And I'll just point out another quick anecdote. This summer, Matinicus Island, which is an island off the coast of Maine, about 25 miles off the coast, one of the furthest island communities out along the entire East Coast, if not the furthest. My family and I went out there this summer for a few days to get away. And when we got on the island, there was just a destroyed house right on the harbor. And so we asked, what that was. And sure enough, that was the Centennial House on Matinicus. And it was destroyed during these storms this past January of 2024. My math isn't the greatest, but I want to say that house was built around 1876 and has withstood every storm since then. And these 2 storms this past January brought that down into the harbor. And it was just a good kind of microcosm for me to see that much of what has stood the test of time along the coast of Maine did not withstand these most recent storms. And I think a lot of folks learned those lessons over the past year. So we can move on to the next slide. And again, I saw in the chat earlier, all of these slides will be shared to everyone who is registered. So I don't want to go through these word for word, but it's important to point out that one of our priorities through our working group was to increase the amount of food consumed in Maine from state food producers, both terrestrial and marine, to 30% by 2030. For so many reasons, this is important, from reducing emissions to increasing resiliency. There was a big focus on this, and I think this is really important. We're a state that produces so many great products. Emphasizing keeping those locally and purchasing locally is a key part of what we focused on. Next slide. And in a similar way, supporting farming, forestry, and fisheries industries in Maine and adapting to climate change. We're really on the forefront of this issue out on the water and working the land. So promoting stewardship of ecosystems that support innovative markets, growing opportunities in fisheries and aquaculture, as well as forest products and agriculture, and really maintaining and expanding equitable access to cultural, traditional, emerging, and heritage industries was a key part. And then obviously so much about this relies on resilience efforts that many of the communities that are part of the call today have their work cut out for them. And we hope that this Maine Won't Wait plan will assist them in doing that. Next slide. And then one of our initial priorities as we were getting our feet underneath us as a working group with the Coastal and Marine Working Group was monitoring, and the importance of monitoring in real time what is happening on land and out in the water. And I, as a marine scientist, long-term data series, as you saw Susie presenting earlier, are so powerful in visualizing what we are seeing day in and day out. When you can look at a chart that goes back years, decades, centuries with actual data, that tells such a powerful story that is really difficult to argue with. And so establishing new monitoring programs, maintaining current monitoring programs that provide us with the data that will help us make predictions and forecasts and really feed those models that are used today is a really important part of what we focused on as a working group. And because I love to give stories and anecdotes, I'll provide another one here. One of the things I was most proud of as our working group was the inclusion of a few harvesters like myself as part of the working group. And one of the best stories I think that came out of our working group came through one of my friends who's a fisherman from Sorrento, Maine. His name is Chuck Bennett, and we'll go to the next slide. Chuck is a young fisherman from Sorrento, Maine. He's a generational harvester. His parents, his grandparents all worked the waters off the coast of Maine. And he is one of the most competent, savvy individuals I know. So I was very excited when he agreed to join our working group. He fishes for lobster, he fishes for halibut, as you could see right there, for pogies, for any number of different species. And throughout this process, I had a lot of conversations with Chuck because, in real time, there aren't many more savvy observers of what's going on in the marine environment than the folks that are out there every day. And I turned Chuck on to the Syracuse buoy system, which is a buoy system off the coast of Maine that monitors any number of different parameters from water temperature to salinity to, well, you can see right here, if you go on the Syracuse website and go to their ocean climate page, this is what will come up, and you can select your buoy location. This one right here is the Western Main Shelf buoy. You saw it referenced earlier by Susie. This is the buoy that's closest to me that I reference just about every day. You can look at, as you can see, I selected water temperature right here and daily. You can look at it monthly, but the top and the bottom of the yellow band are the 20+ year maximum and minimum. The blue line is the mean for that specific parameter from 2001 all the way through 2023. And then the black boxes are daily means for that individual day, that particular year. And if you look at this, you can see we had a fairly like average winter, and then got a little warm March and April, and this is at 20 meters at about 60 feet. And it cooled off. And by the end of July, that last data point before we lost the connection was one of the coldest readings for that day in the last 20 plus years. And Chuck found this throughout the Gulf of Maine by just logging on here and going around and searching through all the data to see if it corresponded with what he was seeing in his traps. And then if we go to the next slide, this is something that Chuck found on his own just by going through this. And he looked at the salinity because he was noticing some differences in what he was seeing in his catch. And so he looked at salinity too. And if you look at salinity from the beginning of 2024 right through July, and that's when the buoy, I don't know if it's broken or if it lost connection or what, but all-time lows of the last 20 plus years for salinity in the Gulf of Maine. Chuck brought this to my attention and asked me what we were seeing. And I said, I have no idea, Chuck. You're going to have to talk with people a lot smarter than I am. And he brought this directly to scientists who were part of our coastal and marine working group. And this is fascinating stuff that folks just weren't necessarily aware of. And what he found was a very cold, very fresh slug of water that had entered the Gulf of Maine probably a year or so ago. And the thinking right now, and scientists are still working on this as part of bigger projects, the thinking is that this is a cold, fresh slug of water that probably came down from one of the ice sheets in the north and has worked its way down along the Scotian Shelf and into the Gulf of Maine. A climate change story, no doubt, but different than probably what we thought we would be seeing this summer. And so it was a real lesson in the importance of monitoring in real time to everybody so that we can really keep our finger on the pulse of what's going on and when it's going on. And like I said, this was something that I was most proud of from our working group, was including so many amazing people from so many different backgrounds and really harnessing their expertise and making mine and Carl's job a lot easier than probably it seemed, because we had so many amazing folks on our working group. And I will leave it at that for now, but it's been a really amazing process, and it's humbling to think that there's so many folks on here right now. This is really an amazing group, and I'm excited for the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Kurt. Thank you, Judy, and thank you, Susie, for those great presentations. So now we have time for questions. And I'm going to start, and then remember, everyone, you can put your questions in the Q&A box, and we have Island Institute staff that are going to push them to me. So please put them there. So Susie, what are you most excited about in the updated Maine Won't Wait plan?
I'm not sure if I could pick one thing, Jen, but I'm going to pick two, I guess. I'm very excited about the holistic nature of the report. I think that there's not only is it backed by science, but it also really addresses the fact that we are facing a climate crisis. It addresses mental health. It addresses the science of hope. It really provides a roadmap for action for everybody in the state. And I think that through the contributions of the equity subcommittee, it does really enable every person in the state of Maine to take some kind of action. People always ask me, well, what can I do? I'm not an expert on X, Y, or Z. And you really don't have to be an expert in anything to take climate action. So I think I like the nature of how it is very action oriented and kind of lays it out. The other thing is the continued emphasis on people power and increasing the capacity of communities, especially rural communities, to take action. This is really enhanced by the Community Resilience Partnership and now the creation of the new Office of Maine, the Office for Community Affairs. Sorry if I messed that up. But that new state office, I think, is going to be a great addition to creating capacity in Maine communities.
Yeah, thank you. So speaking of action, Kurt, what do you think is one of the more impactful action items in the plan specifically for the working waterfront?
Well, this will be a great tease for the resilience talk that's coming up in your next webinar, but I think the Resilience Commission coming out of the Climate Council in the aftermath of these storms um, in such a short period of time. We often hear how government takes, moves in geologic time. This was something that happened in real time and came right out of our work as a climate council and has had a real impact on the ground. We've been able to secure federal funds and state funds to help not only think about how we build infrastructure in the state going forward, but also doing it in real time, the actual building and revitalization of so much of what was damaged, both public and private. There is a laundry list of great things that I think came out of our working group in this entire process, but I think the Resilience Commission is one of the ones that I'm very excited about and very excited about that webinar coming up. But I will also emphasize, like, there is the plan itself that is wonderful. But for me personally, I think the network of folks who are involved in this process is also one of the best things to come out of it, because we could have the best plan in place, but without the people behind it. And as you can see on this webinar, like, there were some really amazing folks who were involved, and going forward, that network is going to be key. And that's something I'm most proud of too.
That's great. So December 10th is the next webinar, everyone, so you can hear more about that. And Judy, thinking again about impact and action, what do you think is one of the more impactful actions that you see that was put forward by the Community Resilience Working Group?
Well, I feel like I'm going to echo what Susie said, and maybe add a little bit to it. The fact that we've acknowledged the social impacts, the mental health impacts, I think is really critical. And the expansion I'll add to that is, climate vulnerability assessments need to do more than just assess the infrastructure. They need to assess the social networks that we have in place and what's needed to improve those networks. And that then leads to the communication networks and the integration across levels of government. And when you're talking about training and technical assistance, it's training in engagement processes. And how do you get the community to come together over what is still very controversial subject matter? So that to me, I think we really stepped up to it there.
Thanks, Judy. So, Susie, I feel like I talk to a lot of people right now, especially who are just feeling a lot of anxiousness around what this winter is going to bring. Like, can we expect this winter to be like last winter? What do you think about that?
That's a really hard question to answer. I think that, what I tried to stress in my 10 minutes was that we are experiencing storms that are more intense, largely because of added precipitation events on top of sea level rise. So a storm that might have been fairly routine or normal historically is now on top of, about 0.6 feet of added sea level rise. And so things that were not causing havoc previously and were more routine are now going to cause coastal flooding. So, I think that the back-to-back nature of those January storms, it's highly unlikely we'd see something like that again. That was unprecedented. But the actual water levels in terms of the storm surge and the predicted tides were not unprecedented. What made it so severe was that it was occurring on top of the backdrop of sea level rise. So that part is not going away.
Thank you for that. So, Kurt, I'd love to hear from you on your perspective as a lobsterman. As a lobsterman, how do you see this plan impacting that aspect of your life?
Well, I'm glad Susie got the prediction about the future question, because I always joke that my crystal ball fell overboard years ago and I haven't been able to find it since. But I think if we are talking about what we will see going forward, it probably won't be the same, but it's probably going to continue to get worse. It doesn't repeat history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes, is the saying. But I think one of the things, and this addresses one of the questions that came through in the chat, like as a lobsterman, we are out on the water most days, and we have the ability to be citizen scientists. And this is referencing Elise's question in the chat. And one of the things that heartened me was through this process, we were able to work with that network I was talking about and secure funds for temperature monitors that dozens of harvesters up and down the coast are putting on their individual lobster traps. And so now we have a fleet of dozens of individuals who are collecting water temperature data that expands the scale that buoy network I was talking about was working at, and really collecting fine scale data that can inform all of the monitoring priorities I was talking about going forward. And we're seeing some really amazing patterns that we wouldn't have been able to really discern without that. And so there are big challenges ahead, but as Elise pointed out, like citizen scientists and everybody doing their part can really play a large role in informing us and then making decisions based on that information.
Thank you for that. Judy, there are folks on this call who are on town committees and town planners. And as a planner, what do you see in this plan, this Maine Won't Wait plan for them? Like very specifically with regard to local land use planning, things that can help with community resilience.
I guess I would say two things, echoing the creation of the Maine Office of Community Affairs, where the very deliberate organizational intention is to combine climate resilience with housing and land use. That is I think, an essential need that communities have to bring those three areas together. And that the technical assistance, I think, that's needed and is developing from individuals within nonprofits and in the regional councils are models for integrating climate vulnerability assessment and climate action plans with local comprehensive plans and land use ordinances. So I think it's the integration of those functions, and not just thinking land use, but thinking land use in the context of a housing crisis, which is not unique to Maine, and vulnerability and risk exposure. So I see that as a real opportunity and a need for additional technical assistance.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you all so much for your time and answering these questions. And just looking at the time right now, we're going to move on. Thanks to all the speakers for your expertise. And so I want to thank all of the audience for joining us today. We really appreciate you being here. We invite you to join us for this entire webinar series, which will feature experts who share their insight, strategy, and action for building coastal resilience in Maine's working waterfront communities. If you want to learn about a particular topic or something that's really pressing on your mind, you can put it in the chat now. Our next webinar is December 10th at 3 o'clock, and we will focus on the new state efforts to help rebuild the working waterfront. The link is in the chat. It's also on our website and our social media channels. We hope to see you all on December 10th. Have a happy holiday, everyone, and take care. Thank you.